What's up, guys? Wanted to do a quick little overview video of the Socom Elite versus the Socom Delta. So the Socom has been one of my favorite knives really for the past 2 years, I would say. I think 2011 is when I first discovered the Socom and I fell in love with it. Kind of a love-hate relationship because at that time I was not really into big knives. So it was a thing where I loved the knife. It cut very, very well for how thick it is, and just couldn't get over how big it was. So I had 3 of my favorite knives. It was the Socom Elite in 20 CV, which probably still at the top of the list for edge retention for me. That knife, I don't know what it was. It was a steel combined with a heat treat combined with a grind. I don't know, but it stayed sharp forever. I mean, it stayed sharp forever. And there wasn't many of those 20 CV knives made. Ended up selling them because I didn't want a big knife. And that's probably my biggest regret to date as far as selling knives. So can never get those back because they never go up for resale. Big mistake. So 6 months later I found this and decided to buy it. It's S35VN, which I've also tested. Their S35 does very well, stays sharp for a long time. But since these knives are no longer being made, and this one is such a good example, I decided to keep this one as a collection piece. So I don't really want to use and abuse this one just because it's very rare now and will never be made again. So it's kind of a collection piece for me. About a week ago, I found out that Microtech is coming out with these Socom Deltas in the drop point. So at first they were solely Tanto version, which I do have one of those in aluminum in CPM D2. But the aluminum is kind of cold. It doesn't feel great on the hand. It's an excellent knife other than that, other than it being Tanto and aluminum. I love it. But when they came out with the drop point version, I had to snag one, and I'll probably snag a couple after this one. So they came out in a very small batch, very, very, very small batch according to the people at Microtech, but these are going to be regular production, and they're going to be pretty common, as common as Microtech gets, which Microtech's, if you don't know how they do very small runs of knives in different steels. So they may make 50 of this knife in S30V, which this one is, and they make the next 50 6 months later in some other steel. So they come out in very small batches. Even though they consider this production, they probably make no more than a handful at the time. And they disperse those, and then 6 7 months later they'll come out with another handful. Anyway, this video is to just demonstrate the differences between the Socom Elite and the Socom Delta. So what you see here, of course, there's a big difference. This is aluminum with inlay. This is 3D Machine G10. Since this is aluminum, you have this skeletonized backspacer with this full thumb ramp here, which I actually do like, very comfortable. Since it is aluminum, you have this really thick, I hesitate to call it a liner lock, but that's the only thing you really can call it. It's a really thick steel liner lock. Always been very, very good for me. Enjoyed the way these lock up. Never had one with blade play, anything like that. The only thing that people did not like about these, and I'm not sure you're going to be able to see it, but there's a coil spring in here, and that's what actually gives the tension on the lock bar. A lot of people were worried about the durability of that coil spring, and I always try to tell people, if done right, coil springs are very, very durable. If you think about their guns, specifically the 1911, so a Colt model 1911, I know of some pieces that are original that still function today, and they have numerous coil springs in them. And those were springs made 100 years ago. So if they can make springs 100 years ago that last this long, then I'm sure our springs today will last just as long, if not longer. So the coil spring really was no issue with me. These knives were really great. They are fairly different from the Socom Delta, but overall feel it's roughly the same. So the handle, the main difference is, of course, this is aluminum with inlays, 2 pieces screwed together, so you can see that line, it's just 2 halves screwed together. The Socom Delta is 3D Machine G10. This is 2 pieces with a titanium skeletonized backspacer. So you have 2 3D sculpted G10 scales, titanium backspacer. You hear my puppy. And Instead of a liner lock, you have a 3D machined, I'm going to call it a subframe lock because that's what it is. Microtech doesn't call it that, but this is an exact copy of a subframe lock. Not going to get into who patented it first. Actually, before Kershaw, there was a guy that did subframe locks, and there was a whole stink about that. So Kershaw didn't come up with a subframe lock. They just happened to be the ones to take it to mass production. So anyway, aluminum scales, liner lock, G10 scales, subframe lock, and this does have a steel insert for the lock face. So this is titanium, the actual subframe lock is, and this has a steel insert for the lock interface. Never had an issue with vertical play on a Microtech knife. They have always been extremely solid, extremely reliable. So pivot, this has ceramic bearings in the pivot. This also has ceramic bearings. So kind of the same old there. Difference being that you can adjust the pivot with this, you cannot on this. This is a T30 Torx, and they actually have proprietary Torx screws. I have not found a T30. Max I found is T25. I'm sure they're made, I just haven't seen one offhand. You can buy the tools to adjust your knife from Microtech if they have them in stock, which they don't always. The cost is about 150 bucks. So if you want it, there you go. The blades on these are actually different. So the overall shape is about the same, not as much upsweep on the Socom Delta as there is on the Elite. One thing to note as well is the grind on the Socom Elite is actually higher and thinner than on the Socom Delta. So this comes up about 3/4 of the way. On the Socom Elite comes down to a very, very acute edge. I'm not sure how well you can see this. Let me try and zoom in on it, and maybe you can see just how thin, if I could get it to work, just how thin it comes down on that grind. I mean, it's very, very thin. The Socom Delta is about half height and does not come to such a thin edge. So there is a difference there. Can't tell you quite yet which one will be the better cutter, although I'm going to go ahead and speculate that it's going to be the Socom Elite. I've done extensive cutting with Socom Elites. They are very, very good cutters despite the blade thickness, and I'm hoping this one will be just as good of a cutter. The blade stock is actually a bit thinner on the Socom Delta compared to the Socom Elite. That's not going to make a huge difference in the type of cutting I'm talking about, mainly due to the big determinant being edge thickness. This is just a tiny bit thicker. It's about 5 thou thicker at the edge than the Socom Elite. The half height grind shouldn't matter much since it is actually a lot thinner blade stock than on the Socom Elite. Can't remember, I think this is 4 mil thick and this is 3 mil thick. So it is a bit different as far as blade thickness. The stock on this is noticeably thicker than the stock on the Delta, which I actually don't mind. It makes the knife a little bit lighter. You don't need such a stout blade on a knife like this, in my opinion. And of course, that is just my opinion. Overall, I like the Delta a whole lot. I will actually say that I think it is an improvement over the Socom Elite. I do wish that it had the same blade profile as the Socom Elite, but I am really growing to love the blade profile on the Socom Delta. This is a bead blast version, which I actually think looks pretty nice. I haven't scratched it so far, and I have stripped wire with it, cut cardboard. I've done some pretty abrasive things with it, but I haven't scratched it yet, so we'll see about that. They do have a black coated version and a stonewash version, which I have 2 stonewash versions on pre-order. Something else to say about these knives, a little difference, is the clip. So this is tip up only, and the clip is fairly obtrusive. So I'm going to grind this down a little bit just so it's not in the way so much. If I could grind this down to be about the same height as the bulge there, then I would enjoy it. This is a little bit less intrusive. You don't feel the clip as much, but it is only tipped down. Some people may not like that. I don't really mind at all. Both have lanyard attachment points. This has a lanyard hole. This has a little lanyard loop. I don't really see 550 cord fitting through there at all. It may if you gut it, but I don't see full 550 fitting through there. This did have the Socom did have a glass breaker on the end. Socom Delta is sans glass breaker, which I don't mind at all. Didn't really have any functionality for me. Blade length on these, about the same. Really, it's almost identical. You can see the blade profile is a little bit different. Like I said before, this has a much shallower upsweep. To me, it looks to be a little bit shallower. Overall, I like both knives very much. So if they came out with another run of Socom Elite, which they're not going to do, I would still buy the Socom Elite just because it has its own walk and talk. Speaking of walk and talk, this thing has a fantastic detent. So the detent on this sucks it right in, saves the energy you put in, and then flies right out. This has very, very weak detent pressure. So it's along the lines of Hinderer. Since I can't take the knife apart, I know what the problem is. The detent ball actually only sits in the hole probably half a thou or 1 or 2 thou. I mean, it barely sits in there. And I can see this little contact point on the tang right here. If I grind a little bit off that contact point, the blade will sit a little bit deeper and engage the detent ball a little bit better. So that's probably what I'm going to do if it ends up bugging me to the point that I want to remedy that issue. But I hesitate to call it an issue because it does have a bit of closed retention. You have to give it a fair shake to make the blade come out. Light shakes, it doesn't come out. In the pocket, it doesn't come out. And you can actually flick it open despite the weak detent. So it's not a huge issue for me, although I would prefer a strong detent like there is on the Socom Elite. Blade steel, these are going to differ as they put these runs out. This particular model is S30V, which I prefer over S35. Not going to say much of anything else about that. I've always had better results with S30V. That's all I'm going to say. Microtech is one of the companies that I've never been let down with heat treat. So I've used S35, CPM D2, and Duratech 20CV with Microtechs, and they have always stayed sharp for a very long time and seem to have very good heat treats. So I've always enjoyed that. Looking forward to seeing how well this S30V stands up with Microtech's heat treat. Should be pretty good. Going to do another formal review of this knife with a little bit more of the specifications and thoughts from use. But so far, I love the knife. Pretty light, coming in at 4 ounces, I think. Right at 4 ounces, could be 4.5. The action is great due to ceramic bearings. Centering is perfect. Build quality on these is fantastic. If this did not have a very weak detent, I would call it a perfect knife. I mean, there is really absolutely no blade play in any direction with these. They are as close to a fixed blade as you can get with a folding knife. So is this one. I mean, they've always been really solid for me. These did have a bit of play before the bearing system came about, but they fixed that with the bearing system. So anyway, hope you guys enjoyed this. If you want a Socom Delta, I would take a look at GP Knives and Blade HQ. They should be getting more of these in. Really, really fantastic knives. Awesome knives. So anyway, thanks for watching, guys, and I'll see you next time.